Picture yourself in a Norman hunting lodge on a winter evening in 1135. The fire crackles in the great hearth, nobles feast at long tables laden with roasted meats and exotic delicacies, and at the head of it all sits an old king, 67 years old, still powerful, still commanding, still making decisions that will shape the fate of two nations. He reaches for his favourite dish, a plate of lampreys, those strange eel-like creatures that medieval nobles prized above almost any other food. His physicians have warned him repeatedly, "Don't eat them, they always make you ill." But Henry I of England has never been one to follow anyone's advice but his own. He's ruled for 35 years through sheer force of will, imprisoning his own brother for nearly 3 decades, surviving assassination attempts and holding together an empire through brutal efficiency. What could a plate of fish possibly do to a man who's survived all that? Within hours, the most powerful man in Western Europe will be writhing in agony, his body convulsing with fever and chills. Within a week, he'll be dead, and within a month, his corpse will become so putrid that it will literally kill the man trying to preserve it, his decomposing brain releasing such toxic fumes that the embalmer will drop dead despite wearing protective coverings. But here's what makes this death truly horrifying. It wasn't the lampreys that killed him. Modern medical analysis has revealed something far more sinister, something that changes everything we thought we knew about one of England's most pivotal moments. You're about to witness the complete unravelling of a kingdom, all because of 7 days of confusion, contradictions, and what might have been the most catastrophic deathbed in English history. This isn't just about how a king died, it's about how his death unleashed 19 years of civil war that would leave England in ruins, all because of what happened in those final, delirious hours when Henry I may have changed his mind about who should inherit his throne, or did he? The men who were actually there, who heard his final words, were mysteriously never called to testify about what he really said. Let me take you inside that hunting lodge, into the bedchamber where England's fate was decided not by armies or treaties, but by the fevered utterances of a dying man whose brain was literally cooking inside his skull. The last week of Henry I's life began like so many others, with a hunt. November the 25th, 1135, and the old king had just returned from pursuing deer through the forests of Normandy. At 67, he was ancient by medieval standards, but Henry had always been different. While his brothers William Rufus and Robert Curthose had been warriors who led from the front, Henry was the scholar, the administrator, the one they called Beauclerc, the good clerk. He'd outlived them both, and not by accident. William Rufus had died with an arrow through his lung in the New Forest, a hunting accident that conveniently happened just days before Henry seized the treasury and had himself crowned. Robert Curthose was still alive, technically, rotting in Cardiff Castle, where Henry had kept him prisoner for the last 28 years. That evening at Lyon-la-Forêt, Henry sat down to dinner with his hunting party. The meal was typical for a royal feast: roasted meats, elaborate pies, imported wines. But Henry's attention focused on one particular dish, a silver platter bearing lampreys prepared in the Norman style, probably stewed in their own blood with wine and spices. These weren't ordinary fish. Lampreys were the ultimate status symbol, so expensive that later kings would literally use them as currency. They were also, according to medieval medicine, extremely dangerous for old men. The court physicians had explicitly forbidden Henry from eating them, explaining that their cold and moist humoral properties clashed violently with his aging constitution. Henry knew all this. He'd been warned multiple times. The last time he'd eaten lampreys, he'd been violently ill for days. But on this November night, the king decided he knew better than his doctors. He ate heartily, savouring every bite of the forbidden delicacy. Within hours, everything changed. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing just a few years later, described what happened with clinical precision. This meal brought on a most destructive humour and violently stimulated similar symptoms, producing a deadly chill in his aged body and a sudden and extreme convulsion. The king's temperature spiked. His body alternated between burning fever and teeth-chattering chills. Sweat poured from him in sheets, soaking through his bedclothes. Then came the convulsions, his entire body seizing, muscles contracting so violently that strong men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself. What's remarkable is how fast it happened. Henry had sat down to dinner as the most powerful man in England and Normandy. By midnight, he could barely speak through the convulsions. The next morning, December 26th, any hope that this was just another bout of food poisoning evaporated. Henry couldn't keep anything down. The fever refused to break. More concerning were the moments of confusion. The king would drift in and out of lucidity, sometimes recognising his attendants, sometimes staring through them as if they weren't there. Word spread quickly through the castle that the king was dying. Messengers rode out in all directions, summoning the great nobles of Normandy. Most importantly, Henry sent for Hugh de Boves, the Archbishop of Rouen. Hugh wasn't just any churchman. He'd been Henry's personal choice as the first abbot of Reading Abbey, before being elevated to archbishop. If Henry was going to confess his sins before death, it would be to Hugh. But here's where things get strange. As nobles began arriving at Lyon-la-Forêt, they found a king who seemed to be two different people. One moment, Henry would be the sharp, calculating monarch they'd always known, dictating letters and settling debts. The next, he'd be rambling incoherently, calling out names of people long dead, reliving battles from decades past. The fever was cooking his brain. We know now, from modern medical analysis, that Henry was likely suffering from Listeria monocytogenes, one of the deadliest foodborne pathogens. It attacks the central nervous system in elderly patients, causing exactly the symptoms Henry displayed: high fever, convulsions, and most critically, confusion and delirium. The lampreys were just a coincidence, or perhaps a convenient cover story. The real killer was probably contaminated food stored in the cold, damp conditions of a medieval castle. By November 27th, the second full day of illness, Henry knew he was dying. In his lucid moments, he tried to set his affairs in order. He freed prisoners from his dungeons. He allowed exiles to return to England. He forgave debts. These were traditional acts of a dying king seeking to ease his way into heaven. But Henry performed them with a strange urgency, as if he knew time was running out faster than anyone realised. The question of succession hung over everything. 15 years earlier, Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned in the White Ship disaster, along with 300 others. Since then, Henry had forced his nobles to swear allegiance to his daughter, Matilda, as his heir. Not once, but 3 times. In 1127, 1128, and 1131. He'd made them take oaths. England had never had a reigning queen, and many nobles despised the idea, especially since Matilda was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a traditional enemy of the Normans. Now, on his deathbed, with his mind drifting in and out of coherence, Henry began saying things about the succession that would later tear England apart. Some witnesses swore he reaffirmed Matilda as his heir. Others claimed he changed his mind and named his nephew Stephen of Blois instead. Still others said he spoke of his illegitimate son Robert of Gloucester as if he were the heir. The truth we'll never know, because the men who were actually in that room, Archbishop Hugh, Robert of Gloucester, and 4 earls, were never formally questioned about what Henry really said. Convenient, considering what happened next. By November 29th, the 4th day, Henry's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The convulsions were almost constant now. His skin had taken on a greyish pallor. Most disturbing of all, he'd begun bleeding, from his nose, his gums, even seeping from his pores. The listeria had likely triggered disseminated intravascular coagulation, where the blood loses its ability to clot properly. Archbishop Hugh performed the last rites, anointing the king with holy oil. Henry managed to make his final confession, though Hugh would never reveal what sins the king admitted to in those final moments. Given that Henry had imprisoned his brother for nearly 3 decades, possibly murdered another brother, and definitely ordered the blinding and castration of his own grandchildren when they rebelled against him, there was probably quite a lot to confess. On the morning of December 1st, Henry seemed to rally briefly. He spoke clearly for the first time in days, asking that his body be taken to Reading Abbey, the monastery he'd founded in 1121. He even specified exactly where he wanted to be buried, before the high altar, in the most prestigious spot possible. Then, around midday, Henry I of England breathed his last. The chroniclers noted, with their love of symbolism, that he died on the 7th day of his illness, the day of rest. About 20,000 men had gathered at Lyon-la-Forêt by this point, waiting for news. When Archbishop Hugh emerged from the king's chamber and announced Henry's death, The wailing could be heard for miles. But if Henry thought death would bring him peace, he was catastrophically wrong. What happened to his corpse over the next month was so grotesque, so horrifying, that medieval chroniclers could barely bring themselves to describe it. The first problem was getting Henry's body back to England. It was December, and winter storms made crossing the Channel impossible. But they couldn't just wait. Without refrigeration, the corpse would decompose rapidly. So they decided to embalm the king right there in Normandy. The procedure took place at Rouen Cathedral. First, they removed Henry's brain, eyes, heart, and intestines. These organs were placed in an urn and buried at the Priory of Notre-Dame-du-Pré. Then came the gruesome part. The embalmers slashed the corpse all over with knives, creating hundreds of cuts so they could pack salt into the body cavity and under the skin. They rubbed the entire corpse with spices and aromatic balms, trying to mask what they knew was coming. Finally, they wrapped the body in ox hides, multiple layers, sewn tight. It wasn't enough, not even close. The man hired to remove Henry's brain died almost immediately after completing the task. According to Henry of Huntingdon, although he wore a thick linen veil to protect himself, the strong prevalent stench of the decomposing royal brain tissue killed him within hours. The chronicler noted with grim irony that this poor embalmer was the last of many whom King Henry had put to death. By the time they got Henry's corpse to Caen, black fluid was already leaking from the ox hides. The smell was so overwhelming that guards had to stand upwind, and even then many became violently ill. The corpse sat at Caen for 4 weeks, waiting for the storms to clear. 4 weeks of continued decomposition, the black fluid pooling beneath the bier, the stench growing so powerful that monks conducting prayers had to leave the chapel repeatedly to vomit. Meanwhile, in England, Henry's nephew Stephen of Blois was moving with lightning speed. He'd been in Boulogne when he heard of Henry's death. Instead of waiting for the formal burial, instead of consulting with other nobles, Stephen raced to London. He had one massive advantage. Matilda and her husband were in Anjou, and most of her key supporters, including Robert of Gloucester, had sworn to remain in Normandy until Henry was properly buried. Stephen reached London by December 8th, just 1 week after Henry's death. The citizens of London, who had their own reasons for not wanting Matilda as queen, welcomed him enthusiastically. His brother, Henry of Winchester, who happened to be the second richest man in England as Bishop of Winchester, immediately threw his support behind Stephen. So did Roger of Salisbury, who controlled the entire royal administration as Lord Chancellor. Here's the audacious part. Stephen claimed that Henry had changed his mind on his deathbed and named Stephen as heir instead of Matilda. His witness? Hugh Bigod, who swore an oath that this was true. There was just one problem. Hugh Bigod hadn't been at Henry's deathbed. He was lying and everyone knew it. But with the real witnesses stuck in Normandy with Henry's rotting corpse, who could prove otherwise? On December 22nd, 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death, and while his body was still leaking putrid fluids in Caen, Stephen was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the coronation even though he'd sworn an oath to support Matilda. His justification: if Henry had really changed his mind, then the oath was void. When Henry's corpse finally made it across the Channel after Christmas, it was Stephen himself who met the ship. In a brilliant piece of political theatre, the new king helped carry his uncle's bier, showing respect for the dead while simultaneously asserting his legitimacy as the new monarch. The journey to Reading Abbey was nightmarish. They travelled by river where possible, because the roads were too rough for the decomposing corpse. Even wrapped in multiple layers of oxhide, packed with salt and doused in perfumes, the smell was unbearable. Chroniclers report that people along the route fell to their knees, not in respect but because the stench made them physically ill. On January 4th, 1136, more than a month after his death, Henry I was finally laid to rest at Reading Abbey. The ceremony was grand, Stephen made sure of that, but several chroniclers noted that the monks conducting the service had to rush through the prayers because the smell, even after all that time, was still overwhelming. Henry had built Reading Abbey to be his monument to eternity, one of the grandest monasteries in England. The church was the 4th longest in the country, a magnificent structure that proclaimed Henry's power and piety. He'd specified that 200 monks should pray for his soul in perpetuity. He'd envisioned lying there forever, his tomb a site of pilgrimage and veneration. Instead, his burial was a rushed affair. the monks desperate to get his putrid corpse into the ground as quickly as possible. The man who'd ruled England with an iron fist for 35 years, who'd revolutionised English government, who'd created the exchequer and the system of travelling justices that would become the foundation of English common law, that man was hurried into his grave like a plague victim. The medical mystery of what really killed Henry has only recently been solved. For 900 years, historians accepted the lamprey story at face value. It made sense in a medieval context. A king dying from gluttony, ignoring medical advice, paying the price for his excess. It was almost a morality tale. But in 2023, medical historians published a groundbreaking analysis. They examined all the contemporary accounts of Henry's symptoms: the sudden onset, the high fever, the convulsions, the confusion, the rapid deterioration. They compared these to every known type of food poisoning, every infection that could have struck a 67-year-old man in medieval Normandy. Their conclusion was shocking. The symptoms match perfectly with Listeria monocytogenes infection affecting the central nervous system. Listeria is one of the deadliest foodborne pathogens even today, with mortality rates of 20 to 30% even with modern antibiotics. In elderly patients, it specifically attacks the brain and nervous system, causing exactly the kind of symptoms Henry displayed. The cold, damp conditions of a November castle were perfect for Listeria to thrive. It could have been in contaminated cheese, preserved meats, even vegetables stored in the castle cellars. The lampreys were probably completely innocent, just a coincidence that gave medieval chroniclers a satisfying narrative about divine punishment for gluttony. This means Henry didn't die from ignoring medical advice. He died from invisible bacteria that nobody would discover for another 700 years. But in a final twist of irony, the false narrative about the lampreys might have actually shaped English history. If people believed Henry died from self-indulgence, it made it easier to accept that he might have changed his mind about the succession in his final, undisciplined moments. Stephen's seizure of the throne triggered 19 years of civil war that came to be known as the Anarchy. Matilda invaded England in 1139 to claim her birthright. The country tore itself apart as barons switched sides repeatedly, built illegal castles, and waged private wars. The chroniclers wrote that during these years, Christ and his saints slept. The war only ended when Stephen's own son died, and he agreed to recognise Matilda's son, Henry, as his heir. When Stephen died in the year 1154, Henry II took the throne, beginning the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. All of this, the civil war, the thousands of deaths, the destruction of entire regions of England, all of it traces back to those 7 days in a Norman hunting lodge, when a king's fevered brain couldn't clearly communicate his final wishes. Or perhaps he did communicate them clearly, but the witnesses chose to forget what they heard. Today, nobody knows where Henry I is buried. Reading Abbey was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. The grave was reportedly desecrated, the silver-lined coffin looted, the royal bones scattered. Modern archaeological surveys have found nothing. The car park that sits where the Abbey once stood might contain the remains of one of England's most consequential kings, or his bones might have been ground to dust centuries ago. Henry thus spent his life building systems of government that would outlast him by centuries. The exchequer still exists today. The common law system he helped create became the foundation of legal systems across the English-speaking world. But his own body, his own grave, gone, vanished, as ephemeral as the smell of rotting flesh that once killed a man from 6 feet away. The king who imprisoned his brother for 28 years, who created the most sophisticated government in medieval Europe, who tried so desperately to control the future through forced oaths and careful planning, that king couldn't even control what happened to his own corpse. He became, in death, exactly what he'd never allowed himself to be in life: powerless, forgotten, and ultimately lost.